Hello, my name's Mike McCarthy. I'm Emeritus Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Nottingham in the UK. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you today about spoken corpora, and I'd very much like to thank tsolacademic.org for giving me this opportunity to take part in this video. My interest in corpora in general goes back to the 1980s, when I was very privileged and fortunate to be able to work with my great mentor, the late Professor John Sinclair. Now, at the time, John Sinclair and his colleagues were engaged in a very big dictionary project, the COBIL Dictionary Project. And if you want to write a dictionary of the language, it's of course very important to get as much data as possible to be able to describe the whole language. And in those days, it was certainly, and still is, much easier to collect written data. So it's not surprising that the COBIL project and similar projects relied mostly on the collection of written data to build their corpora. And this also was added to the difficulties of creating spoken corpora at that time. We didn't have the sophisticated audio technology that we have now. The software wasn't as capable, and the software was designed for lexicographers, for people who write dictionaries anyway, so things were very different in those days. Then in the early 1990s, I moved to the University of Nottingham and began work on spoken corpora with my colleague Ronald Carter, and we built the CANCODE spoken corpus, C-A-N-C-O-D-E, Cambridge and Nottingham Corpus of Discourse in English. By that time, written corpora were very big indeed, tens of millions of words. But spoken corpora have always, of necessity, been somewhat smaller because of the immense costs involved in recording, transcribing, etc., the spoken data. And it's also quite difficult to obtain the appropriate ethical permissions and so on. CANCODE, nonetheless, is 5 million words of everyday data, which is extremely useful. Also now, spoken corpora are much easier to collect. We have miniaturized audio recording equipment. The software is much better, more capable of handling different kinds of data. So in a way, there has been a revolution, and the spoken corpus has indeed come of age. My particular area of interest is conversation and conversational corpora, and there are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, of course, conversation is, for most of us, the most typical way that we use language in every day of our lives. We talk to our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, our family, etc., and expend an awful lot of language every day, much more than we write. But secondly, a good reason for collecting spoken corpora is that it is actually quite difficult to be objective about how we speak. It's much easier to be objective about how we write. When we write, we can revise, we can change things, we can cut and paste, we can do all sorts of things. We can reflect on what we're doing. When we speak, we have no such opportunities for reflection. It's in real time, conversational speech at least. There are other kinds of more formal speaking where we do have time to think, but everyday conversation is real time, online, face-to-face, so we don't have time to sit back and reflect and observe how we speak. Therefore, it's not surprising that a lot of the ways in which we describe language, and as a result the ways in which we teach it and what we teach, are based on notions that come from the written language. So the question is, what do we learn by using spoken corpora? What's the difference? What are the different insights? And if there are different insights, what is their relevance for language teaching, for TESOL? Well, as you probably know, one of the standard techniques that corpus linguists use is to count frequency. We can create frequency lists which tell us what are the most frequent items, words or phrases or grammatical patterns in the language, and equally what are the rare or hardly ever used words and phrases and patterns. So frequency lists are quite useful. A couple of years ago, my English profile colleague, Dr. Paula Buttery, and the English profile, incidentally, is a very big project looking into learner English within the framework of the Common European Framework of Reference. And I would invite you to visit the website of the English profile. My colleague, Dr. Paula Buttery, and I did an investigation where we took the top couple of thousand most frequent words in the British National Corpus spoken segment and compared them with the similar top 2,000 words in the British National Corpus written segment. Now, we found, of course, that there was a great deal of overlap. There's no surprise there. There's hardly anything that you can write which you cannot say, and vice versa. But the overlap came to about two-thirds, about 65%. And that meant that there was a good third, about 35% of the words, which were unique to either the spoken list or the written list, which was fascinating in itself. So there is evidence that the most common vocabulary of writing and speaking is different, one compared with the other. Similarly, my colleague Ronald Carter and I did a comparison of the top 50 words, the 50 most frequent words in our CanCode corpus and in a same-sized corpus of general written English consisting of newspapers and books and magazines and so on, typical everyday written texts. And we found that there were a number of words in the spoken list, the spoken top 50, which didn't appear in the written top 50 at all. These included words like right and well, and the verbs know and think, K-N-O-W. Know is obviously very, very frequent because people are all the time saying, you know. Now, there's a tendency sometimes, and I've had to confront this tendency in lectures and conferences and things that I've written. There's a tendency to think of expressions like, you know, as being rather lazy uses of language, sloppy, not the sorts of things we would want to teach as language teachers. But believe me, everybody uses them all the time. Educated speakers, speakers of all ages, genders, geographical backgrounds, everything. We do it all the time. Why? Because we are constantly reaching out to our interlocutors, the people we are talking to. We are constantly monitoring the conversation. We want to give out this signal that, well, you and I, we share the same world. We share the same life experiences. We're on the same wavelength, you know. And this is important, this reaching out, this creation of interaction. Not just what we are talking about. Of course, we may be talking about our jobs, our holidays, our friends, anything. But what is really much more important is how we do it and how we try to create this relationship with the other speakers, to create this interaction between us. And that's one of the things that leaps out of the frequency lists if you compare spoken and written language. And if we think of words like right and well, then obviously these are very useful words for organizing our conversations. We use right, perhaps if we want to end the conversation. Right, see you tomorrow. Or right, let's talk about something else, a way of organizing our topics in the conversation. So again, not just what we're talking about, but how we talk about it. Well is an interesting word. People often say to me, do you live in Cambridge? And I usually answer, well, near Cambridge, because I happen to live in a village about 8 miles outside of Cambridge. Why do I say well? Because I've been asked a yes-no question, do you live in Cambridge? But I can't answer it as a yes-no question. So I have to give out a signal that says I'm going to take the discourse in a different direction. I can't take it in the direction that you have projected. So these words like well and right, they're very important organizational words. They are strategic ways of organizing and managing our conversations. So it's not surprising that they are incredibly frequent in the spoken corpus and maybe absent until quite considerably way down in the frequency list of the written corpus. If you like, they're small words with very, very big meanings. Other small words are, for example, the word just, which is in the top 50 spoken but not written. I could say to you, can I ask you a question? But I can make it much softer, much less in your face, much friendlier by saying, can I just ask you a question? Can I just ask you a question? So it's these little, what I call interactive words, this repertoire of vocabulary in the most frequent spoken lists that we get from spoken corpora, which create interaction. And they suggest to us that there is indeed a fifth skill, which we can call the skill of interaction. Over and above being able to pronounce things correctly, over and above being able to talk about our experiences, we need to have the appropriate way of doing it, the appropriate way of engaging with the other person or persons who are there in real time in front of us. And I think this is one of the very big things that I've got from studying spoken corpora. But it's actually not just vocabulary that we learn a lot about when we look at spoken corpora. We learn a lot about grammar as well. Just as with the vocabulary, of course, there's not a unique grammar of writing and a unique grammar of speaking. Again, there's a good deal of overlap. There are no structures in writing that we can't use in speaking, and vice versa, no forbidden structures, as it were. But there are a lot of grammatical items and patterns which are incredibly frequent in one type of expression and very infrequent or rare in the other. So some things are very frequent in speaking, very infrequent in writing, and vice versa. I'll give you an example from something that's very frequent in the spoken corpus, the informal spoken conversational corpus, but not in most writing, and that is what is sometimes called ellipsis, which is the non-occurrence, the non-use of things which we expect to be used, or which the rules, quote unquote, which the rules say we must use. So if I say to you, want another cup of coffee? Or finished yet? Then it would be very strange if you replied, who are you talking to? Me? The dog? Somebody in the street? It is, of course, obvious that I'm talking to you. It's clear within the situation. That's why we call this situational ellipsis. We don't need to say, do you want another coffee? Have you finished? So little things like auxiliary verbs and pronouns can be, as it were, omitted. Now, I hesitated there before saying omitted because, of course, really nothing is omitted, nothing is missing when we say, want another cup of coffee. This is the normal grammar of conversation. Indeed, you could say that when we write, we add things rather than when we speak, we omit them. Writing has to be more elaborate because 99 times out of 100, the written text is intended to be read by somebody else at a different time and at a different place. And so it has to be more specific, more elaborate, whereas the spoken grammar can rely very heavily on the current context, the situation that we're in. Another example of spoken grammar is the way that we can exploit the tense and aspect system to create friendliness, politeness, indirectness. Again, this problem of not being too much in your face. I could say to you, for example, I want to ask you a question. But I could make it, as I said earlier, slightly more friendly by saying, I just want to ask you a question. But I can also use the grammar. I can make it past tense. I just wanted to ask you a question. And by using the past tense, I'm distancing myself a little bit more from the bluntness, from the directness of the request. Similarly, I could say, I wonder if you could do me a favor. Or I could make that past tense. I wondered if you could do me a favor. Or I can make it past continuous. I was wondering if you could do me a favor. So these ways of using the grammar are quite common in the spoken language, but less common in the written language. Another example would be the way speakers will often preface something that someone has told them or that they have read, and as a sort of headline when they're going to tell you something that they think is exciting or newsworthy. So people say, Mary was telling me they're going to build a new supermarket, or Tony was saying they're going to build a new supermarket, or I was reading in the paper that they're going to build a new supermarket. So again, this use of the past continuous is something that's very common in spoken language, but we don't find it in the written corpus. If we look at a corpus of newspapers, we find the past tense. The President told Congress. The Prime Minister stated. Somebody else said, rather than was saying. So again, we have something that belongs to the spoken grammar because of the way we interact with other people, because of this face-to-face nature of conversation. But then the real question is, what relevance does all this have for language teachers and language teaching, if any? Well, I think it's all very, very relevant, and I found it to be extremely useful. As well as being a researcher and academic, I'm also a writer of language teaching materials. That's how I make my living now. And I find the information I can get from spoken corpora is absolutely invaluable in the preparation of materials that help people in developing their speaking skills. And I'd like to give you one or two examples. In the Touchstone and Viewpoint courses that I am co-author of, we have tried in every unit to incorporate what we call conversational strategies. That is, the language and the skills that you need to create and maintain good interaction, this fifth skill that I was talking about earlier. Now here's an example. If you look in the corpus at a typical conversation, you will find people respond to what they hear. But they don't always respond by just saying yes or no. They often do something more, and they use a repertoire of small words which mean the same as yes or no, but which create a much better sense of interaction and engagement. So instead of yes, they might say absolutely, definitely, certainly, or a little phrase, that's right, yes, that's correct, indeed. And instead of no, they might say definitely not, certainly not, wow, no, absolutely not. So we show what I call good listenership. That is, we show that we are engaged as listeners by using this repertoire of small words and phrases, to which we can give the convenient name response tokens. Response tokens are extremely common. The meaning of absolutely in the written corpus is an emphatic adverb. The meal was absolutely delicious. The city is absolutely beautiful. In the spoken language, its most common meaning is simply yes, an emphatic, engaged yes. How can we bring this into our language teaching materials? Well, I have often thought about what we call the listening skill and how this works inside and outside of the classroom. Outside of the classroom, when we listen, if someone is giving us information, we acknowledge that information with words like, indeed, yes, absolutely, definitely, certainly, fine, great, okay, wonderful, oh, appalling, that's dreadful. We show that we have understood, and we also show that we are engaged. And I think one of the problems is that in the classroom and in our materials, we focus too much on this question of have you understood the message, the content, have you understood the information that the speaker is trying to give you. In the materials of which I've been co-author, we've tried to, as it were, kill two birds with one stone. That is, of course, we test the learner's understanding of the content, but at the same time, we want to see if they can respond appropriately. So as well as creating activities and exercises to test and check comprehension, We give the learners an opportunity to show that they comprehend it by being able to respond appropriately, to choose an appropriate response from a list of responses, or to create their own responses, taking them from controlled to more free expression. So by doing this, we are reflecting more truly the conditions under which listening takes place in real life, the way that we respond. And response is all the way through a spoken corpus. It's evident everywhere, but it's not evident in a written corpus. So it's one of the great gains that we make by using a spoken corpus as the source of our data. So what the spoken corpus does for me is more than just give me information about what people talk about. It actually shows me how they do it, this fifth skill of interaction. But above all, it actually makes me rethink how we might bring this knowledge into the classroom, how we might actually teach and what we might teach. So if we're teaching speaking skills, let's not forget the way the grammar is exploited in speaking skills, and the way the vocabulary is exploited. And if we are teaching listening skills, let's not forget that listening is all about response. So the spoken corpus changes our knowledge of language, but it also makes us rethink somewhat how we might go about teaching language. Well, I think it's clear by now that I think that spoken corpora have not only been incredibly useful to me, but that I believe that spoken corpora have a major contribution to make to TESOL, to language teaching in general. I hope that you might become as passionate about spoken corpora as I am. And as they become more and more available, we'll be able to do more work and inform our language teaching and language descriptions. We're living in a very exciting period at the moment where technology is advancing very rapidly, where software and hardware are advancing, and spoken corpora will benefit from those advances. Not least, we have now the reality of multimodal corpora, where we can combine video like this with audio and a transcript of the conversation all on one screen, and this has greatly increased our capabilities, not least to incorporate gesture and body language and other information about intonation and so on, and how these all fit together into one picture. But above all, I think spoken corpora have shown us just how important it is to look at different types of language, and not just to think of language as one great homogeneous whole, whether it be writing or speaking, or academic speaking, or writing for the law, or speaking in business. We have learned that by looking at specific registers, specific contexts, we can learn a huge amount that we just would not previously have had access to. And also it means that if we are looking at more specific types of language, we can target our spoken corpora better, and we don't actually need such massive amounts of data. And some very good studies have been done on business speaking by Michael Handford, for example, in his excellent book, which was based on 1 million words of spoken data. And others have done studies on media data. Anne O'Keefe's work, for example, her book on media discourse, Steve Walsh's book on classroom discourse. All of these have been done with far less amounts of data, smaller data sets than would have been considered appropriate 25 years ago, when, as I said, most people were aiming for the goal of very large dictionaries or very large reference grammars to describe the entire language. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this short video, and again I'd like to thank tsolacademic.org for the work that it's doing and for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I wish you every success in your own professional endeavors, and hope that you will get a chance to research spoken corpora, and that you will in the future be able to reflect upon such work with the same amount of pleasure and satisfaction that I'm able to do now. Thank you very much for listening.